Good evening, guys, and welcome back to another program here on Legally Speaking. We are coming to the end of the year 2021. I know some of you are very excited about that. So far, we've made at least 8 videos in this program, Legally Speaking. And this program today would be the very last one for the year 2021, at least in this format. I have one more video that will come after tonight's program. It's going to be a little different than the first 9. So stay tuned for that one. Should be interesting. But I really want to thank you for watching these first 9 programs so far, and for taking the time to leave your feedback, to share the content with your friends and family, and just being a part of this new journey that I have embarked on. Now, this program tonight brings to an end what has become a 5-part series looking at estate planning. And tonight's program we're going to be looking at the will, as I promised, and how you make a valid will. What are things that you have to keep in mind when you're writing that will? So that would be what we're going to be going over in this program. And of course, I'll summarize what we've covered so far in this series, and also I'll be sure to remind you of the advantages and disadvantages of making a will versus a deed of gift. And I want to also let you know that I will be responding to every comment on these first 9 videos during my holidays. I know that responding to people is important, and I don't always get the time to do it in the moment, but I promise that during the holidays I would be responding to all of you, all of the comments, all of the questions, whether you made those comments here on Facebook, on YouTube, where I share the links on Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, wherever you might have made comments or asked questions. I'll make the time to get back to each and every one of you. And I also want to encourage you to leave a comment in the comment section if you have a particular topic that you want me to cover in the new year. I'll be back in the very first week of the new year, the very first Monday in the next year. And I have a list of topics that I want to cover, topics that that interest me personally, things that I do habitually. But I also want to get your feedback on what sort of things you want to learn about, to hear about. And so leave those comments as well, and I'll do my best to incorporate them when I'm doing my schedule. And again, if you have any comments that you want to make, any questions that you want to ask, drop them in the comments. And even if I don't get back to you immediately, at some point I will respond to all of you. So I want to thank you again for looking at these programs and for sharing them. It has been, even though it's still new, it has been an exciting and rewarding venture thus far, and I look forward to sharing more time with you guys into the new year. So with that said, let's jump into tonight's program. I want to thank my sponsor, Be Well Pharmacy, who jumped in as a sponsor very early in this series. They are now open, as I probably mentioned in the last video, so be sure to check them out. They are located on Grenville Street, opposite the Anglican Church. Yes, opposite the Anglican Church, so be sure to check them out, the newest pharmacy in Kingstown. And I also want to wish you guys a happy holidays, and I wish you the best for the holidays as well as for the new year. This year has been very challenging, but I believe that next year will be better. I mean, can be worse, right? Knock on wood. So thank you guys so much. Now we're looking at wills and making a valid will. What are some of the things that you want to keep in mind? Well, as I mentioned before, when you're making a will, you can only pass on in your will what you own. So stands to reason, if you don't own a property in Montreal, you can't leave in a will property at Montreal to my son Xavier, right? In order for you to pass on something in your will, you must actually own it. And as I mentioned before as well, you must own it at the time of your death. And so if you made a will today, and today is the 6th of December 2021, if at the time of your death you would have disposed of whatever property you left in that will, then you don't own it at the date of death, you can't pass it on via will, because the will takes effect at the date of death, right? So you want to keep that in mind. Number one, I could only pass what I own, and that ownership does not necessarily have to be legal ownership, as in you have a title to present to say, I own this. It can also be an equitable interest, and we spoke about equitable interest before in previous videos. So if you have not watched those videos, you might want to go back and check it out, because I gave at least a brief, simple explanation of what an equitable interest is. You can pass legal and equitable interest in a will, right? So you want to keep that in mind. And of course, if what you own legally, someone else has an equitable interest in it or a legal interest in it, keep in mind you can only pass what you own. So if you own something jointly with somebody else, then it stands to reason that what you'll be passing in the will would be your interest in that property, for instance, if you are holding it jointly with somebody else. Very, very important for you to keep in mind. One of the things I want to remind you as well is what is called testamentary freedom. So in some jurisdictions, there are laws that govern family provisions. And so if you are a relative of the deceased and no provision was made for you in that estate, you can make an application to have some sort of provision left for, say, children, for instance. In St. Vincent and Grenadines, you have full testamentary freedom. So if you have property and you don't care to leave it to a relative, you want to leave it to somebody, a close personal friend, you have that freedom. There's nothing that says you have to leave your property to anybody who is related to you or might have helped you in some way. That's your decision to make, and yours only. I also want to share with you how marriage and divorce can affect your will, because that's going to be very important. And so in St. Vincent, the Wills Act governs wills, and you want to keep in mind that if you get married or you get divorced, those things can affect your will, right? So here is what the Wills Act has to say about marriage first and then divorce. So if you are a single man or a single woman and you make a will, well, guess what? Getting married revokes your will. How many of you know that? I don't know. But getting married revokes your will, except in certain circumstances. Here's what the Wills Act has to say about getting married. It says that where it appears from a will that at the time it was made, the testator was expecting to be married to a particular person, and that he intended that the will should not be revoked by the marriage, the will shall not be revoked by his marriage to that person. So you are expecting to be married to a particular person, and from the way the will was made, it is very clear from the will that, look, I don't intend for my will to be revoked. It would not be revoked. It goes on to mention not just the will in particular, but specific provisions made in that will. So it continues, where it appears from a will that at the time it was made, the testator was expecting to be married to a particular person, and that he intended that a disposition in the will should not be revoked by his marriage to that person, that disposition shall take effect notwithstanding the marriage, and any other disposition in the will shall take effect also, unless it appears from the will that the testator intended a disposition to be revoked by the marriage. Right? So, single people, keep in mind, if you have a will, you've made a will, you get married, the will is revoked. That's the general principle, unless it falls into one of these exceptions. Right? So you want to keep that in mind. Getting divorced also affects your will. So you've been married, you have a will, and you get divorced, and now there's a decree absolute that has annulled your marriage. What is the position of your will? Is it still valid? Let's say in the will you had left your entire estate to your now ex-wife. That could be a problem. So what does the Wills Act have to say about decree absolute in relation to your will that was made? Now, essentially, where a testator has made a will, a decree of the court dissolves or annuls his marriage or declares it void. Void marriage. Talk about that another time. The will shall take effect as if any appointment of the former spouse as an executor or as the executor and trustee of the will were omitted. So that those provisions are omitted. And any device or bequest to the former spouse shall lapse. So, good news. So you made a will and you left your property to your former spouse. Well, your spouse. You got divorced. Good news. You don't have to remember, I made a will. I have to, whatever gift that was left to your former spouse in that will is void unless there is a clear intention that your former spouse should still inherit whatever was left to them in the will despite the divorce. So I start there because I just figured that not a lot of people pay attention to these things, and so I think it's important for me to mention those things up front, how marriage and divorce affects the validity of a will. Moving forward from there, as I have mentioned, and I continue to remind you, the importance of reducing these important matters to writing. And so with a will, naturally it has to be in writing. Alright, word of mouth, as I continue to say, is of no value. In order for a will to be valid, it must be reduced to writing. It must also be signed by the testator, and the testator must have the mental capacity to make a will. So if you're a minor under 18, you can't make a valid will. Similarly, if the person preparing the will has any question in their mind about the mental capacity of the testator, the person making the will, they have a responsibility to have that testator medically examined and have that medical doctor make notes contemporaneously to basically explain or certify that at the time of making the will, this person was of sound mind. And so that is important, because in a situation where making that will was left until this person was old or unwell, it could raise issues of undue influence and even fraud if the state of mind of the testator at the time the will was made was in question. So you want to make a note of that, right? So that you don't wait until you're old, sick and dying to go ahead and make your will. But in any event, it's always good practice, best practice, to have the testator medically examined and have that certificate showing that, this person was checked out and they were mentally sound at the time they made the will. So the will must be signed by the testator, or it could be signed by somebody else in his presence and by his direction. And now, for one of the more important things that you want to keep in mind, the will must be witnessed by two witnesses. The signature of the testator must be made or acknowledged by the testator in the presence of two or more witnesses present at the same time, and each witness either attests and signs the will or acknowledges his signature in the presence of the testator, but not necessarily in the presence of any other witness. Right? So when that will is made, it must be witnessed by two witnesses. Very, very important. And who are these witnesses? Number one, the person witnessing the signing of the will cannot be a beneficiary under the will. So let's say your father or your mother is making the will, and in that will they say, okay, I'm leaving my property at Stubbs to my son Jamali. Jamali can't be one of the witnesses under the will. The will would still be valid, but the gift to me would lapse. So I can't witness it. My spouse can't witness it either. That's very important for you to keep in mind. Otherwise, you could end up in a situation where the gift under the will lapses because the witness is also a beneficiary under the will. So you want to be careful who you ask to witness that will. So let's say, for instance, going back to this property to Jamali in Stubbs, let's say that will was witnessed by 3 witnesses, not 2, and I was one of the witnesses. If that will could be deemed valid by the signatures of the other 2 witnesses, my gift will not lapse, because at the end of the day, there are 2 valid witnesses under the will, and so my signature could essentially be ignored. So one of the next thing that you want to keep in mind is, if a will leaves a gift to a beneficiary and that beneficiary predeceases the testator, that gift is void. And so in the same example that I used before, if a parent leaves a gift to a child and the child dies before the parent, that gift does not pass on to the child's spouse or the child's children. The gift is void, right? In order for the beneficiary to actually benefit from the will, they must live out the testator. And that is one of the reasons why it's very important for you to have what is called a residuary clause in the will, in the event that one of the beneficiaries predeceases the testator. Now, moving on, if you want to revoke the will, the revocation of the will must be essentially conforming to the same requirements for a valid will. So you can revoke the will by making a subsequent will, and that subsequent will or revocation, in whatever form it takes, must be reduced to writing, it must be signed, and it must be witnessed in the same way the original will was signed. If this requirement is not met, the revocation would not be valid. You can also burn the will, tear the will, if you want to revoke it. And I think I covered this in my previous video when I mentioned the benefits of having a will is that you can change your mind, and so you can burn it, tear it, revoke it, essentially change your mind down the road. So at this stage, you understand some basics, you have some basics to work with. Do you need a lawyer to make a will? Not strictly, you don't. But it is still advisable because, number one, it's a very important matter, especially if it's a large estate, and because of its relative importance and relative inexpense, it's always best for you to have it done by a legal practitioner, because there are other issues that could come into play. There are certain presumptions that are written into the law, for instance, as far as constructing a will is concerned, and so you want to have a legal practitioner assist you with this process, because you must ensure that the will complies with all of the requirements of the Wills Act, as well as ensuring that whatever your intentions are can be carried out, and some presumption or some other exception does not defeat your intended purpose. Right, so just to recap very briefly, making a will versus deeds of gift, you're essentially looking at time and money here. The deed of gift is quicker in the sense that the transfer takes place immediately and there's nothing else to do on your debt, at least if there's an absolute transfer or a situation where a name was added to the deed and it was under an arrangement where it was a joint tenancy, and we explain what that means already. So it's quicker. If you have a will, you have to probate that will and pay taxes and wait time and publish in the newspaper. So it's a longer process, and it could also be more expensive, especially if the estate is very valuable. Right? So you have the time and the money. But the will gives you the benefit, one, of upfront inexpense, and number two, it also gives you the freedom to change your mind subsequently if circumstances change. Right? So that's really been it for this series on estate planning. We touched on estate planning, touched on making a valid will, we touched on deeds of gift, we touched on intestacy, very, very important, intestacy. And so that brings us to the end of video 9, and I'm happy to be moving on to more topics in the new year. So I want to encourage you, if you have not already, to subscribe to the YouTube channel, and you want to click that notification bell so that you never miss any of these episodes. Thank you so much again for looking at these videos and sharing it with your family and your friends, and I look forward to seeing you in our next video, special Christmas edition, and I'll catch you guys in the new year.